very briefly introduce Cristina, who needs no introduction because she has been teaching in UMass Amherst. Is that right? She was just telling me she taught here for 3 years. Is that right?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah. So I'm
Up
sure
and down, yeah.
many of you have come across Cristina and her work before. Miss Maria Cristina Marcuzzo is a honorary professor at the Sapienza University of Rome and an internationally recognized scholar in the history of economic thought, with major contributions to the study of classical monetary theory, the Cambridge School of Economics, and Keynesian economics. Her extensively scholarly output includes over 100 journal articles and monographs, as well as more than 20 edited or co-authored volumes. Her work has played a central role in shaping contemporary interpretations of Keynes, Cambridge economics, and 20th century monetary thought. And in today's presentation, she will be presenting on Joan Robinson, examining her theoretical innovations, her position within the Cambridge School, and her enduring influence on debates over capital theory growth and economic methodology. And with that, I will hand it over to Cristina to present her paper. Thank you. And oh yes, Diego will also be a discussant. But thank you very much, Cristina, for joining us.
Yeah, John, thank you very much for this nice introduction. And cannot tell you I'm delighted to be back, albeit only still in online. But I have such a nice memories of my stay in UMass, and it has been a wonderful experience for me. I met a lot of friends. I made friends there. Don is one of them, and so I'm really delighted to be able to meet you all. Okay, so what I'm going to do is to give you, sorry, I don't know why it's not moving. Okay, perhaps, okay. So let me just give you a very, very brief overview of some biographical details about Joan Robinson. Like, as you can see, she was born in 1903 in a place close to London. She came from a comfortable middle-class family, and the family went into some kind of economical distress when her father was sacked from the British Army because he wrote an article accusing Lloyd George of lying on the strength of the British Army during the First World War. And being a general, that's not the kind of thing that you're supposed to be doing. So he was sacked from the army, and as a result of that, her family got into serious financial distress. But she came from a tradition of descenders. Um, Her great great grandfather was expelled from King's College, London, because he said that he thought that the eternal damnation was rubbish. You can't think something like eternal damnation. And again, this is something that if you were a minister, you're not supposed to be saying. So she said herself, I was brought up in an old liberal tradition, believing in progress and rationality of human behavior. And so she came in a family in which somehow liberal values and dissenting opinion were bread and part of her life. She came up to Cambridge in 1922 and she went to Girton College. At the time, women were allowed only in two colleges, Newman and Girton. And this is a very brief overview of the situation at the time. In 1881, women were admitted to examination at university. They were eligible to titles of degree. And in 1923, to the university library at university lecture, and for the teaching offices and membership of the faculty. The interesting thing is that a separate room was provided for the examination of women students. Each class of honor, the same standard was set for men and women. So there was separation, but somehow the standard was the same. The other interesting thing is that, the Cambridge and Oxford system is based on supervision. You meet your supervisor, say once every fortnight, you present a paper and then you discuss it with your supervisor. And the interesting thing that women were allowed to be supervised only with a chaperone. Only a man had to accompany this student to be supervised. And this is apparently how she met her husband, who was at the time a junior assistant of Pigou. So that's how they met. But that's even more interesting. Only in 1948, mind you, only in 1948, women were admitted to full membership of the University of Cambridge. So that gives you an idea how being a woman in those days made academic career particularly difficult. And obviously she went through that because uh, that was the situation at the time. And between 1911 and 1948, few women got a first. First, you know, in the tripos, this is the top mark. Okay, the top mark. If you don't get a first, you suppose you don't proceed very much in academic career. And the tripos are divided in part one and part two. And what is important is to take a first in part one or in part two. But Joan Robinson was not one of them. She did not get a first. So apparently she was not in the position to be ready for a full academic career, but things went otherwise, luckily. Okay, so this is a picture of her when she was a student, just a student at the at Cambridge, 1921, 1922. As you can see, you can see from the look, she was already very stern, she was already very firm, but she had a kind of sweetness about her, which I think eventually she lost in her appearance. But people who knew her well said that she could be a very wonderful friend on a personal matter. She could be a very fierce oppositor and contester when it comes to discussing political or economic matter, but on a personal level, I was told that she was somebody that could be very affectionate, very friendly to a lot of people. Okay, so as I said, she met Austin Robinson in when she was supervised by Pigou. By the time Austin Robinson was already embarking an academic career, but then they married in 1926, and Austin Robinson was given a job in India to be in charge of the education of the Maharaja Gwalior, one of the sons. At those days, you know, especially the prince states had a system of education. You ask an important British scholar to come over and to be the tutor of the prince of the Maharaja. And that's what Austin did. And so they went to India for 2 years. We have corresponded from that time. She got very bored to be just the wife of Austin over there. And she was very looking forward to coming back and to do something useful. But something useful appeared all of a sudden because there was a dispute between between the state of Gwalior and the central government of India over a matter of taxation. So the matter was deferred to a committee in Parliament in England. And Joan Robinson started collaborating with these people in order to present the case of the state of Gwalior. And so she came back to Britain 5 months earlier than her husband, just to work on this. So this was the first example of her involvement in economics matter and in terms of policy. She was always she was always defending the underdog throughout her life. This is characteristic of her. She always took the part of the weakest, and that's something that remained throughout her life as a characteristic. Okay, so she came back to Cambridge because by that time Austin was given a job in Cambridge, but she didn't have any job at the time, and so she went back and she tried to, you know, to have some connection with people who were very important at the time. And that's where she met two people who were going to be very important in her intellectual and emotional life. Richard Kahn, who was, of course, Keynes' favorite pupil, and Piero Sraffa, the Italian economist who Keynes rescued from Mussolini, who was persecuting him for an article he had written. And so he asked Keynes' help, and Keynes helped him to come to Cambridge. And then eventually Sraffa was given a job. I will tell you more about Sraffa in a minute, but Sraffa and Kahn were two, and Keynes, of course, were the three people who had a very important influence on her. Perhaps I would add to that Michael Kaleski as well. But I think Kahn and Piero Sraffa. Kahn was a very strong personal relation. I think there was some also passionate phase in their relationship. And Piero Sraffa was just a friend relationship, and she was very much in awe of Sraffa. Apparently, Sraffa was one of the few people that could intimidate her, but she felt very much the influence of Sraffa. And so she attended Sraffa course. Sraffa gave for 3 years a course on advanced theory of value. And while Richard Kahn was preparing his fellowship dissertation, which was called Economics of the Short Period, where we find the first outline of the economics of imperfect competition. So everybody believed that, the theory of imperfect competition was first developed by Joan Robinson, but I think that can be proved that at least the outline of it was already present in the dissertation, which was not published. As a matter of fact, I was instrumental to have it published 50 years afterwards, because I worked with Richard Kahn for 1 year, and I persuaded him to publish his fellowship dissertation. It then remained unpublished, but certainly Joan Robinson read it at the time that it was produced. But the great influence in those days was Sraffa, who was also instrumental in suggesting that the theory of perfect competition should be abandoned in favor of the theory of imperfect competition. And she herself wrote, Mr. Sraffa lecture, where penetrating our insularity, it was calming committing the sacrilege of pointing out inconsistency of Marshall. Because Joan Robinson is famous for having said Marshall was economics in Cambridge, and Marshall possibly was economics everywhere else in the early 20s. He was the most important economist all over the place, but of course it was very insular, meaning that it was an approach that didn't have the same influence elsewhere. But certainly Marshall was very, very important in shaping economics in the 1920s. Certainly influenced Keynes, certainly influenced many other economists. So why was Sraffa committing this sacrilege? Well, barely over 25, 26 years of age, had written an article that Marshall had inconsistency, that the theory of Marshall had an inconsistency. And the basic idea that was in Marshall. And that gave origin on the basis of Sraffa. Was Sraffa, followed by Pigou, Shaw, Robinson, Young, and so forth. And what was the issue? Whether the Marshall theory was consistent and whether it was realistic. Okay, so what were the point? What was Sraffa was saying is that Marshall was extending, was using the idea of increasing and decreasing return or increasing and decreasing cost to the firm, while this argument could only be applied to the industry, not just to the firm. In other words, if you are a firm in perfect competition, you're very small, so you're not supposed to have any influence on the prices of factor that you're using, because your use of the factor is too small to have any effect. So the hypothesis of increasing cost, which is behind the rising supply curve, is inconsistent. And on the other hand, the idea that cost can be, the average cost as also a downward sloping segment, it doesn't make any sense, because if you increase in output, you can lower your cost. Why don't you continue to produce more and become the only monopolistic in that market? What stops a single firm to become the only monopolist in the market? And so this was the issue of consistency. And then the issue of realism. He said, well, if you ask any businessman, said Sraffa, what prevents you to increase your production? They will tell you it's not the cost, it's rather the market, it's rather demand, the constraining factor. And so again, on this aspect, Marshall theory lacking realism. This is not how things work in reality, all right? And so she was exposed to this controversy, and her first contribution, she wanted to defend, in a way, Marshallian theory, saying, well, as long as you state your assumption clearly and you know what is the domain of your assumption, you're entitled to do that. What you're not entitled to do is to extend the domain of your analysis beyond what your assumption allow you to do. And so she was trying, in a way, to defend this, but of this methodology of making unrealistic assumptions, which she said they were made by the mathematician who would defend logic and realism, and the Sergio Playman would do exactly the opposite. She was trying to make a case that there is a sense in which economists make unrealistic assumptions, because they have this box of tools that allow them to make prediction. And even if we know that this assumption is unrealistic, still this is the only way to go about it. There's no other way. So let's have a better look to Sraffa's argument in the 1926 article. Basically, what Sraffa did was to challenge the symmetry of demand and supply in the determination of prices of individual commodity in condition of competition. First of all, the approach is partial analysis, as we know. It's not, you assume the ceteris paribus clause. You assume everything else is constant. And so you assume that you can analyze the market of a particular commodity without taking into consideration what happens to the other commodities or to other markets. And this is, of course, something that is not entirely convincing. But as I told you before, the main criticism is about the assumption of thinking of the U-shaped average cost curve, the having first decreasing and then increasing cost. And as Rafa said, they are rest on different set of causes, which apply to industry and not to individual firm, or they cannot be assumed to work in perfect competition because nothing prevents a single firm to become a monopolist. And so both these assumptions are considered to be not valid. So Joan Robinson was exposed to this Rafa criticism, who presented in the article and in the lecture. And at the same time, she wanted to make a name of herself. Okay, remember, she wanted to become an academic. And she had to have something, she had to have a book, she had to have something to prove that she could do it. And so she wrote this book which she called her nightmare, called a nightmare. It took 2-3 years to, and the starting point for Sraffa's proposal to derive the theory of value, starting from the conception of the federal monopolist, and Kant checked every single passage, because Kant was in America at the time, and there is a very nice anecdote about it. He was staying with Schumpeter. Okay, Schumpeter was at Harvard, and Kant was guest of Schumpeter. Schumpeter was notoriously a womanizer, as you know, but Kant was very concerned that he would notice that he was receiving mail from a married woman. So he wrote that he would wake up very early to catch the mail before Schumpeter, not to let Schumpeter know that he was receiving all this mail from a married woman. Talking about 1932 and so forth. So that's a lovely story, but that is documented. I can't check every passage. And what Joan Robinson did in this book is to extend the technique, Marshallian technique, to all market forms. And she thought that she had provided the answer to the challenge provided by Sraffa by saying, okay, let's have a theory that have all the possible cases, monopoly, imperfect competition, and so on. And so the question of consistency of the Marshallian theory doesn't arise. And the book finally gave her fame and academic responsibility. There is a letter from Arbeler to Kant in which he asked, who is this J. Robinson? It's too much a clever book to be by a woman. So again, she was exposed to that kind of continuous criticism or not recognition just because she was a woman. But the book, the 1933 book, put her on the job market, as it were, even if it took her. By the way, she was made professor only 1 year before retirement, a couple of years before retirement. So it took her a long time to get her. Anyway, the book gave her academic responsibility, and she started teaching in Cambridge. So the defense of Marshallian methodology was based on the idea that provided that you make your assumption clearly and you take into consideration all possible cases, then you can show that perfect competition become a special case, not a general case, and therefore the challenges posed by Sraffa do not apply because you have all the spectrum of possibility. And she said, well, this dispute between competition, perfect competition, and perfect competition is not so relevant. What is relevant is the time factor. And this is something that she would come back all over her life, you know, so logical time, historical time, the importance of time in economics. And that's for her was always the issue that needed to be addressed. So the question is, what do we make of imperfect competition? By the way, if you open this book, you find the same diagram that you find in a first year microeconomic text, not a sophisticated one, but all these curves, all the kind of analysis that you find in any elementary microeconomic books, you find imperfect competition. So the question is, was Joan Robinson really making a revolution by introducing this element, or was just a turning point? Why do I make this distinction? Because a turning point is certainly a fresh start on a different track, which may or may not subvert previously held conviction, while a revolution is a change the way we address fundamental issue and is generally opposed to the prevailing ways of thinking. So when you do a revolution, you change the way in which you look at the problem. A turning point is just a fresh start, but it's not. I believe that the perfect competition was just a turning point because the book appeared to provide a way to rescue Marshall from Sraffa, but in fact, it did not. And in fact, Joan Robinson herself in early 50s, when she wrote the introduction to the second edition of the book, she became very critical of the book, and she said, "What's a blind alley?" From there, you don't get any really change in the way economics is done. So one of the reasons why she became so critical and she abandoned that research project, of course, the Keynesian revolution. And she was part of the group of people, together with Joan Robinson, Rafa, Khan, who were asked to comment the first draft of the Treatise of Money. And these people attended Keynes' lecture, and they wrote a manifesto in which they challenged certain proposition asserted by Keynes in a lecture. And Keynes himself said, because of these arguments within the circus, within this group of people, help him to abandon the Treatise on Money and approach and to develop the approach, which eventually became the general theory. And well, just to give you a sense that Joan Robinson, by that time, she had become a very respected and well-considered economist, because she was one of the few people to whom Keynes sent the general theory for comment, and she read all the proof. And in the Keynes paper, you can find her comment to the proof of the general theory. I think that the influence of Kahn and Robinson on Keynes, who had remained basically Marshallian, you can see that because Keynes presented the argument of the general theory in terms of demand and supply for the output as a whole, which is not something that you find in the treatise, in which is much more a flow stock kind of approach. Because in the end, Robinson and Kahn, they share the belief in the validity of the Marshallian approach that need to be amended but not completely abandoned. Unlike Sraffa, who had written that the Marshall theory should be abandoned altogether because the marginal analysis doesn't make any sense. So I think that Jo Robinson was caught in the middle at one point in her life. While Kahn remained committed to Marshall, was not entirely convinced by Sraffa. I think Robinson, because of the influence of Kalecki and Marx, she moved away from the Marshallian approach and became much more close to Sraffa. To the point that after Keynes had died, she said that Kalecki framework was somehow superior to Keynes, is because in Kalecki you have a markup pricing constant marginal cost. You don't have the Marshallian. And Kalecki, of course, met Joan Robinson in 1936. They became friends, and Kalecki was helped by Joan Robinson to find a place in Cambridge. Eventually, he had to leave and went to Oxford because could not have another job appointed. And Joan Robinson said in the 60s that she was Kalecki rather than herself that brought in perfect competition with theory employment. So she became very concerned that Kalecki could be recognized. Then I have here a list of the books she wrote to popularize and to extend the general theory. And in particular for this little book, which I would recommend even nowadays, people want to have a sense of the general theory, this introduction to the theory of employment. And Keynes wrote to her, "You have been very successful in simplifying, have stated some of the complication beautifully." And this book was meant to be an introduction to the general theory for undergraduate. And even nowadays, I think if you want to give to first-year students something easy to read, I think that I would still recommend the introduction to the theory of employment. As a result of this activity, she became obviously well respected, but people were not entirely convinced, and Keynes had to step in to prevent her to prevent her to teaching, because they felt that she was too committed to the Keynesian cause, and Keynesian cause in mid-30s was not accepted by everybody in the faculty. So she had a hard time to be given a job, but eventually she did. Okay, one of the important influence on Joan Robinson was Marx and the Marxists. In the 30s, Marxism was popular among undergraduates. And she began studying Marx in 1940. She said because she wanted to have a distraction from the news of the war. And she began reading Marx, and Maurice Dobb and Kaleski were very supportive. And the way in which she read Marx was to say, forget about the theory of value and the theory of price. This is not relevant, and the transformation problem is all rubbish, and try to concentrate on the things were important, the theory of accumulation, the theory of crisis, of capitalism, and so on. And she said, for this reason, because I've attacked some part of Marx's system, I've been treated as an enemy by the professed Marxists ever since. She was very supportive of some of Marx's ideas, but she was not, in a sense, convinced by all that you can find in Marx, particular theory of prices and the transformation. And she said, for me, the main message of Marx was the need to think in terms of history, not of equilibrium. And when you turn to the general theme, the wrong period, you have to start with Marx's scheme of expanded reproduction. And that's what happened in the 50s. You know, people want to extend the general theory, which is set in a short period framework, to extend it to the long period. I might skip this, is what this issue are that Joan Robinson address today. Address if you want in the discussion, we can come back to that. Let's go to Zrafa and what he meant to her. What she said we were doing in the 50s, that we realized that we didn't have a theory of the rate of profit, because on the theory of effective demand, you can determine the level of total profit, but you cannot determine the rate of profit, because in order to determine the rate of profit, you have to know the value of stock of capital. But if you don't know the rate of profit, you cannot have the value of capital. And so she said, I have very many discussions with Pedro Zrafa on this matter, but he would not tell me anything positive. But then I saw in the introduction to Ricardo Principio a gleam of light on the question of the rate of profit of capital. So the idea is that if you have, in Ricardo, when you have a core model, you can measure very easily the rate of profit because you have input and output of the same commodity, so the problem of value doesn't arise. But if you want to measure capital in value term, then you have to know the rate of profit. To know the rate of profit, you have to know the value of capital. And there is no way you can do that in a neoclassical system. And it's okay. So this is Joan Robinson in her 50s. I'm rushing a little bit because I want to finish in time. So Zrafa solved the problem with this little book in which everything is done in terms of physical terms. And the question for Joan Robinson is that what Zrafa was giving us is the possibility of getting out from the marginal productivity theory. Remember, in order to determine the rate of profit in the marginal theory, you have to know the value of capital. And the idea that profit and the marginal productivity of capital, Joan Robinson says, to totally nonsensical and illogical. And what Zrafa gave us is the idea that the classical doctrine that the rate of profit, it depends on the technical structure of production and the share of wage in net output. This is the result that comes from Zrafa work. So this gave origin to the so-called reswitching and capital controversy that was very important in the debate between the two Cambridge UK and Cambridge US. And Joan Robinson insisted that what Zrafa taught us is that the factor ratio cannot be used to analyze change in the factor taking place through time, because in time the value of the quantity of capital may change. Why? Because depends what happens to the rate of profit and wages, and the distribution influence the value of capital, and so you cannot use the neoclassical apparatus to determine distribution. And this is something she was very keen on. You cannot discuss changes in your classical term. You have just to use differences. Okay, let's let's go quickly to the growth model. That was what she did in the 50s and in the 60s, in which again she worked on the theory of accumulation, and she wanted to find out whether there is any inbuilt mechanism by which full employment could be reached. And that was the program of setting up a theory of the accumulation in the long period, based not on the neoclassical theory, but based on the classical tradition, Marx reproduction scheme, Ricardo, and the classical theory of growth. And during that time, she was very passionate in showing that one has to distinguish argument based on ideology, argument based on logic. And this is a way that she spent all her time by saying, look, you have to look at what economists say when they are hypotheses. And sometimes these hypotheses are to support ideas. And what you have to do as an economist, you have to unmask this propensity of economists of covering up logic with ideological consideration. And this is something that she said about free trade and protectionism, which is very topical nowadays. Free trade is supported by people who can benefit from it. And this was the topic of her professorial lecture. She was made professor basically a couple of years before retiring, which is, this is the time in which she became professor. And by that time, she became obviously the beacon of the new phase in the 70s, what was called post-Keynesian economics. And she said, I've been trying for the last 20 years to trace the confusion and sophistry of current neoclassical doctrine to their origin in the neglect of historical time and static equilibrium theory, and to find a more helpful alternative in the classical tradition, revived by Sraffa, Ricardo, Marx, a little bit of Marshall, certainly Keynes, and certainly Kaleski. And this is what now is considered to be post-Keynesian economic theory. And unfortunately, this attempt by Joan Robinson to put together these two traditions, classical tradition and Sraffa on the one hand, and Kaleski and Keynes on the other, is not successful. I don't think that they were fully integrated, and she attempted all the time to put together, she's the only one who tried to put together all these different Cambridge traditions to have a synthesis, but I don't think that she was successful. Certainly she did not convince Keynesian that Sraffa could be brought in, and the Sraffian don't think that some of Keynes' idea fit into their, so even if she remained an optimist in doing that, I don't think that she succeeded. Let me finish with a project that she felt was not accomplished, but she was desperate to have it accomplished. And this is what people are doing nowadays, trying to put together all these different, I'm thinking Anwar Shaikh, I'm thinking of people you might know that are trying to put together these pieces and bits. And I'm not sure that this can be done. I don't think that it can be done. So let me finish by in memoriam, okay, by remembering her. She said, I have realized more than ever how much one whole personality is involved in one's pure intellectual work. I think the reason I've done so much more with a much weaker brain than any of us is because of my extremely simple-minded attitude. She was among these giants, Sraffa, Keynes, Kahn, Kaleski, and she felt that she had a simple-minded attitude. I don't believe this is true. I think that she was intellectually daring and not simple-minded. She died in Cambridge after 7 months of coma in 1983. And let me finish this portrait that was given for a lodger who lived more than 10 years in a room in her house. A strict vegetarian, she slept all the year round in a small creeper-covered hut at the bottom of the garden. It was entirely unheated and open to one side to all weather, but no storm, deluge, or frost could persuade her to sleep in the house. Every morning at 8:05, I would see her walking over the lawn to her breakfast of yogurt in a maroon dressing gown and with her long gray hair hanging down her back. In the early spring, she was often woken by tits pecking at her hair for material for their nest. Once she awoke to find a new pair of Marks and Spencer bedroom slippers entirely filled with nuts. The squirrel came from Trinity, she declared, promptly and considerately reverting to her old pair. That's it. Thank you. Sorry, I might have done a little bit of time, but hopefully
Thank
not.
you, Christina. I think we have Diego is going to be the respondent today. Is that right? Thank you,
Yes,
Diego.
can you hear me well? Everyone can hear me?
Yes?
Yeah.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, cool. Okay, so before starting reading what I prepared, I want to do a disclaimer. My approach to Joan Robinson have been mainly through reading Christina's work. I have the habit of not going to, maybe it's a bad habit, but going through the works of my previous generation instead of going to directly to the authors. Uh, so a lot of the work that she had presented today, as she mentioned in the email for preparing the discussion, that is in her papers and so on. So it was kind of enjoyable and easygoing to prepare this discussion. So I'm gonna read what I prepared. So to begin with, I thanks to Professor Marcuzzo for the lucid and intellectually disciplined reconstructions of Joan Robinson's life and work. I think that what is particularly valuable in this presentation is that it does not treat Robinson merely as a contributor to isolated debate, but as a figure unifying internal tensions of Cambridge, the British Cambridge economics, to become visible and analytically tractable. As she demonstrates, Robinson trajectory is structured by a persistent tension between two distinct Cambridge traditions. That's how I interpret her work. On the one hand, the Marshall Keynes line, oriented towards demand, short period analysis, uncertainty, and later Kaleki's theory of pricing and unemployment. On the other hand, the Sraffian revival of classical political economy centered on surplus distribution, choice of technique, and the critique of marginal productivity theory and capital measurement. Robinson emerged in Christina's narrative as the theorist who repeatedly attempts to reconcile these traditions, thereby revealing the depth of their incompatibility. She organizes the intellectual biography around three integration attempts. Rather than revisiting each in detail, I will treat them as a compact diagnostic. First, the early effort to answer Straffa by generalizing Marshallian tools through imperfect competition. Second, the mid-century attempt to extend Keynes to a long period through accumulation theory, profit rate reasoning, and Marxian reproduction schemes. And third, the early 70 articulation of post-Keynesian economic as an explicit research program intended to draw simultaneously on Ricardo, Marx, Keynes, Kalecki, and Straffa. Professor Marcuzzo's conclusion is decisive. The two Cambridge strands were never fully integrated by Joan Robinson, an issue that herself was fully aware. But I will say, from a Lacatosian perspective, she was the pioneer on framing post-Keynesian research program instead of a theory as an enclosed or finished and close-ended theory, which remains a project even today, and still have not been able to have a completed synthesis. So I would like also to advance a strong interpretation. My suggestion is that Joan Robinson's repeated failure to integrate reflect not only incompleteness, but an epistemological incompatibility. Once Straffa's critique of Marshall, beginning with the 26 attack on the coherence of competitive supply under partial equilibrium, and systematizing the classical surplus framework of production of commodities by means of commodities is taken seriously, the Marshallian apparatus can no longer serve as a foundation for a general theory of normal prices of competition. It's worthwhile to recall that in the tradition of classical political economy, the role of marginal analysis is to explain rising cost of agricultural production as the worst land plot, to analyze rent and the social surplus. In other words, diminishing returns for the classicals and Marx, the critique of the classicals, was mainly a law about land and rent, as demonstrated by De Pancar in his prize-awarded paper on land rent. The marginalist toolkit is about the productivity of land plots and consisted with value theory, but was never related to a general micro law of the firm as in Marshall. Robinson's first attempt sought to preserve Marshall. Her later work increasingly challenged equilibrium as such, yet she never fully relinquished the Marshallian conceptual language, and this, I will argue, repeatedly blocked the synthesis. From this perspective, the coherent division of labor is the following. For the long period, Strava provides a framework in which normal prices and distribution are anchored in the choice of technique and the wage profit configuration. For activity levels, instability, Keynes and Kalecki provides the logic of effective demand, monetary production, uncertainty, and Markov pricing. Marshall becomes historically informative, but theoretically non-essential for this classical Keynesian reconstruction. This brings me to Robinson's engagement with Marx, which I take to be among the most productive elements highlighted in Professor Marcuzzo's presentation. She shows that Robinson rejected Marx's theory of value insofar as it was treated as a theory of relative prices, and she regarded the transformation problem as a theoretical dead end. On that narrow point, proportionality between labor values and relative prices is indeed not the core explanatory payoff of Marxian theory, yet Robinson's insistence on Marx's reproduction schemas and on the primacy of historical over logical time provides a powerful framework for understanding capitalist disequilibrium. Recent work strengthens this intuition. De Pancar's reconstruction of Marx's Capital 3 volumes architecture and previous work by Occhio on macrodynamics of accumulation, published first in the 60s, second edition in 76, recently translated in English from Japanese in 2022, both demonstrates that Marxian expanded reproductions can generate a smooth path of accumulation in logical time. Crucially, however, the conditions required for a smooth reproduction are highly stringent. Once analysis moves into historical time, as Joan Robinson would say, where aggregate demand is politically managed and export operates in some extent as a source of autonomous demand, and where distribution is shaped by institutional, technological condition and class struggle, those conditions are regularly violated. In this sense, Robinson's emphasis on historical time captures something fundamental. This equilibrium is not an exception in capitalist reproduction, but a normal outcome of reproduction under historical specific constraints. Finally, I would like to propose a contemporary reinterpretation of Robinson's rejections of value theory. While Robinson was right to reject value theory as a simple predictor of relative prices, this does not justify abandoning it altogether as a theory of surplus and exploitation. Early empirical work, notably by Anwar Shaikh, reported strong regularities linking labor values and prices in 1984. More recent evidence suggests, though, that such regularities no longer hold in a stable way. A plausible explanation, one that I believe that Robinson would have treated as plausible at least, is that the historical transformations of capitalism, particularly the growing redistribution of surplus labor, of surplus value towards unproductive and rentier activities under financialization, and its deepening throughout the rise of intellectual monopoly capital, has weakened or broken the empirical mapping between labor values and observed prices. In this context, Marx's distinction between productive and unproductive activities becomes analytically central once again. Following De Pancar's and Ryu, a Korean author, works under Foley's new interpretation, the transformation problem is not a dead-end alley anymore, but instead it has been resolved with a valuable empirical research program explaining, for example, the shifting away of manufacturing regime in South Korea in the aftermath of the financial crisis, as done in Ryu and Park paper of 2020. So I would like to conclude with a question for Professor Marcuzzo, uh, which is the following. Your presentation uses Joan Robinson life and work to stage the unresolved tension between Keynesians and the Straussian tradition within the Cambridge economics. Should your history of economic thought approach here be understood not only as a reconstruction, but also as a methodology? That is a way of using Robinson's intellectual trajectory to identify what is structurally compatible or incompatible between these two strands. In this sense, is Robinson's unfinished synthesis a historical contingency, or does it reveal the theoretical limits of integration themselves? That would be my discussion.
Thank you, Diego. I was wondering, unless there's a question right away, whether we could ask Christina to respond to that question. Would that be okay, Christina?
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you.
Well, it is, first of all, thank you, Diego. I think it's a very careful reading of my work, and I really appreciate. It seems that you got almost everything right. And I think that you've done an excellent job in reconstructing what I have to say. As to your question, well, you see, I can answer this way. If you want to do a complete theory, to have a theory that encompasses everything, then the integration is not possible. But if you accept, which I think we should be accepting, that we should have partial theoretical apparatus for handling separate problems, then I think that we can work with different type of tradition. So I think that if you want to have such a, like in the general equilibrium, a theory that encompasses everything, then you cannot put Rafa and Keynes in the same box. But we don't need to do that. Why should we want to do that? If I want to analyze the problem of effective demand in the short period, I'm perfectly happy to have Keynes. If I want to do market theory of prices in a situation, I'm perfectly happy to have Kalecki. Perhaps Kalecki is more helpful than Rafa. But if I want to knock off the idea that the rate of profit is determined by the marginal productivity of capital, then I need Rafa. I cannot have this. So if the acceptance that we should not aiming to have a general theory in which everything stays in the same box, that is going to be frustrated, because there's no way that these two traditions can be together. But if we accept to work as impartial equilibrium, namely dealing with the theoretical analysis, which is more appropriate to the particular problem that you have at hand, that this can be done. And so I'm perfectly happy to be Raffian, Kaleckian, and Keynesian according to the type of problem I have to handle. That would be my answer.
Please raise your hand either in real life or in your emoticon option if you have a question for Christina. While people are mulling over questions, I will ask a follow-up question in that regard to you, Christina. So the interpretation you just gave, that one can be a Keynesian in the short run and a Sraffian in the, well, not necessarily the long run, but in a particular context, depending on the question you're asking. Do you see that as Robinson's own approach, or is Robinson looking for the general theory, the impossible general theory in this case?
Well, she tried. No, she said the post-Keynesian, so-called post-Keynesian theory is based on the idea that you could put everything together. No, I mean, you're not. I'm thinking Anwar Shaikh, but I can name other people who have done. People who consider themselves post-Keynesians. They use models in which you try to put everything together. that doesn't necessarily mean in a general theory. You see, model is not a theory, okay?
Mm.
So a model is something you build in order to do some empirical work. You want to predict something or to analyze something. And so in the model, you can make as many assumptions as you want, and that doesn't make a general theory as such, you know, because a model, you pick up the assumption and so forth. But if you want to represent, to describe the world with the tools of only one theory, then I think that is a different story altogether. And I think that Joan Robinson would agree that we should be able to use theory according to the kind of problem that we want to do. What she wanted to do, to lose the importance of some tradition. If you're Keynesian, don't forget your Rafa, okay? And if you're Raffian, don't forget that there is something Keynes had taught you, because in Rafa there is no money, okay? So how can we analyze capitalist economy with no money? So if you are Israfian, you have to be prepared to say Israfa is giving up the answer to one particular question, the theory of distribution, the possibility of determining prices without any marginal analysis, but it cannot give us an interpretation, an explanation what's going on in a capitalist world. And so I think that the message she's giving us, if you are Israfian, don't forget your Keynes, and if you're Keynes, don't forget your try not to make too much of the kind of Marshallian things that are still there. You know, the theory of investment in Keynes, somehow, you know, marginal propensity, the marginal propensity to invest, the marginal efficiency of investment, they are very much reminiscence of the marginal productivity of capital. And so they are very much committed in a way, I mean, and to the idea that you don't, and Keynes somehow didn't get completely off his Marshallian shoes, and I don't think this is a particularly problematic, as long as when you're dealing with distribution, you say no, come on. When we're talking about distribution, forget about this Marshallian stuff. But if I want to interpret capitalist system, Zrafa is not giving us all we need. And so we need to have Kaleski, we need to have Keynes, we need to have people who give us the tools that are necessary to interpret the capitalistic world. I think that Joan Robinson would agree to that. But of course, she was initiating a process in the 1970s, which was not at all obvious, namely to bring all these people together. So I think she needs to be recognized as the midwife of the process, because she said, look, let's put these people together, not forget any of this, because each of them can give us something important to understand the capitalist system.
And as long as no one else is raising their hand, please do raise your hand if you have a question. I will follow up with one more question about that. So do you see that project as having a success? I mean, in the sense that post-Keynesian theory involved productive conversations across these divides. Do you see that as continuing? Do you see the kind of productive coming together that Joan Robinson was advocating for as and still happening today? Or do you think that project itself has come up against limits?
No, I think there are a lot of people who consider themselves post-Keynesians. They would stress more one thing than the other. For me, the dividing point is model building. Okay, people seems to be very keen in having models, and so when models, you have a kind of freedom that allow you to do whatever you think is important. While you're writing and you're not doing a model, but you're interpreting something without a model, then the kind of concept that you're using, that shows which are the things that you consider more important. If I want to analyze the financial crisis of, post Lehman Brothers or so forth, Some people have found that Kaleski is more useful than Keynes, that Minsky is more important to understand what's going on. And so in interpreting a piece of reality, I'm not talking about models, in interpreting a piece of reality, then you find people that they have freedom, to use the concept that they think are more appropriate to the situation. And I think this is what is going on. I mean, if you are not a neoclassical and mainstream economist, that's what people are doing nowadays. They might be stressing, so Peter Scott might be one who is more keen in doing Kaleski, and Anwar might be more interested in doing Marx, or people give different flavor to the kind of combination of concept. But that's what non-neoclassical people are doing nowadays. I don't think there is no other game in town. If you're doing non-neoclassical economics.
Diego, you have your hand up. Do you want to ask a question?
Yeah, but I think someone else was, or I can go late after.
Oh, am I just not seeing the hands? Sorry, please do speak up
Okay,
if
I'll
anyone
go.
else.
I have a question.
Oh, Guillermo, yes. Guillermo, yes.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Cristina, for your excellent presentation. It was like very comprehensive and yeah, amazing, like tour de force, like all the Robinson's trajectory. I have a couple of questions. My first question is when it comes to maybe the areas or topics, what are those topics that you think need to be further explored from Robinson's thought and theories? What are these topics that you believe there are contributions that can be made, like that they have not been developed enough? And my second question, you mentioned at the beginning that Kaletsky, Keynes, Rafa, Kahn, all these people were uh, instrumental in Robinson's thought. Um, uh, but like to what extent also Robinson influenced the developments and the theories of all these like thinkers and economists, because she had like so many areas of thought. She did like great contributions in each topic. She kind of started to think about. She made like great contributions. So maybe now like these contributions have not been acknowledged enough because she was a woman and because like she faced so many like difficulties in like make her work let's say acknowledged. And that's it. Thank you very much again.
Thank you, Guillermo. Your first question, what would it be there? Well, I think that their criticism of equilibrium needs to be pursued more and more. We all our economics is based on some idea of equilibrium. The way in which, or stationary state or some resting position of the system. And while she was insisting in much more dynamic and less static analysis. And this, I think, is something that should be pursued and follow up more. But in order to do though, you have to get out from the habit that in order to deal with this problem, we need more mathematics. It's not the mathematics that is needed, to have sophisticated dynamic analysis and so forth. It's the way in which you approach the problem. When she said Marx taught us to think in terms not of equilibrium, in terms of, and I think that this is a lesson that Robinson is telling us. Try not to think always in terms of equilibrium, but to think more in termical or historical occurrences. And the second question, whether well, of course, I think that her presence herself was an incentive to these people to react, and to, I would find difficult to find the area in which I said, well, Keynes was influenced by Joan Robinson. Well, Keynes was influenced in the sense that she made a lot of comments to the general theory, and some of them were taken up by him. Kahn sometimes was critical of Joan Robinson, but he reacted to the kind of objection. I don't think that Rafa was Rafa was not influenced by any one of these people because his tradition was a Marxist tradition. He was influenced by Wittgenstein, by Gramsci. That the kind of influence on him. And Kaleski certainly was in conversation with her. So I would find difficult that such a powerful intellectual figure was not influential in a sense of, putting the relevant question, objecting to the answer, and so forth. But if you ask me to pinpoint something particular concept that she brought to these people, then I would find difficult to give you a precise answer.
Jonah, you have your hand up?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, thank you for the presentation. I was just wondering, I guess, if you could talk a little bit more about your experience preparing this presentation and I guess where you think you will take this research. So I was wondering, it seems like you've drawn a lot both on published and maybe some unpublished material, and I imagine you've been familiar with a lot of Joan Robinson's work for a long time. So was there any particular surprises maybe in the letters that changed how you thought about her? And yeah, and I guess, I'm wondering, are you...
Well, I can tell you how I came to do this kind of work. I started working on Joan Robinson in the late, just after she died in '83. And there are two episodes that put me on this trail. The first one, when in Italy, there was this project by a publisher. They wanted to collect a few paper by her and translate it into Italian. For some reason, I was approached. I had not done anything on Robinson. I've done other things, but by chance, I was approached this publisher, and he said, "Would you consider?" And I said, "Well, to put together a collection of paper by Robinson, I need to know more about her. I need to know more about her work, and I would like to meet her because by the time I did my work my graduate work at the London School of Economics, but I used to go to Cambridge occasionally and so forth. So I said I might go to Cambridge and talk to her. And the first thing I asked her, so she invited me over to tea, and I asked her whether I could have a list of her work so I can go through. And she said, "Oh, I don't keep that record." She was very blunt. She said, "No, I don't know how much I did write in the past. You do it. Why don't you do my bibliography?" So I decided, well, maybe this is something. And then, I did. It took me 20 years off and on to finalize that bibliography, which has 434 items, okay? At the time where there was no internet. So most of the time I went around the libraries to check catalogs and so on. And so this was published many years afterwards. It is now published. It is the full, complete bibliography of Joan Robinson. But that was some kind of preparatory work. What made me work seriously on her was Jeff Harcourt, which was one of Joan Robinson's closest friend and colleague. When she died, he went to her office and took all the paper. They were left there. And he was supposed to do the biography of Joan Robinson. But then he said, "You will do a better job than me." And he handed over this box. And I start looking into the paper. I must tell you, the Joan Robinson paper are not much. She wrote so much. There is not much unpublished. While what it is interesting is the correspondence. But the correspondence, it is on the other end because she didn't keep anything. So luckily, we have the letter she wrote to Kahn, the letter she wrote to Keynes, and I used that material. I did a lot of archival work in my life, especially more on Keynes, but on all these Cambridge people. And certainly the archival work helped me to put everything in perspective, especially to put her in the context of Cambridge economics, of which she was certainly a towering figure. But you can understand that if you don't understand Keynes, you don't understand Kahn, you don't understand all these people. So, and I did a lot of archival work in my life, not just on that, but my recent work, archival work, is Keynes as a financial investor. And I published recently on work on that. And this was a lot of archival work. Very boring one, because you have to go through all these numbers and try to make sense. Why did he buy this at that time? Why did he do this? Why did he do that? And that was very pain in the neck, I must tell you, to go through this. But in the end, I was very happy, because I think I have a convincing story of what kind of financial investor Keynes was. So to answer your question, yes, using archival material has helped me a lot to understand both Joan Robinson and the Cambridge economists.
There any more questions for Cristina?
I had a comment
Yeah.
following up.
And Merle?
But Mer can go first, because I did my
Yeah, why
discussion.
don't you go, Mel? Because Stega's already spoken.
Okay, thank you. Hi. My question is about the theory of imperfect competition. So I'm not so knowledgeable, unfortunately, about Joan Robinson's work, but I was struck by how you explained that she later came to be critical of her 1933 book, because I always thought that the term imperfect competition was, I really associated that with her. So what I'm wondering is, so I studied with Anwar Sheikh, and so I know about his criticism of the idea of perfect and imperfect competition. And I was wondering if you could explain and how far that applies to Joan Robinson's earlier work, and whether it also still applies to her later conception, where it seems she maintained, the theory of markup pricing, but do you think that, but you also, pointed out how she came to highlight the importance of non-equilibrium thinking and, historical trajectories. So I was wondering if you could reflect on Anwar Sheikh's criticism of imperfect competition and how it applies to Joan Robinson's thinking throughout her life.
Well, I'm not familiar nowadays. I know Anwar work, and he's a friend, and so we've been discussing. So I can't remember exactly what his criticism was. But I can tell you that, imperfect competition in that book is a particular version of imperfect competition. It's supply and demand. I mean, she invented the marginal revenue curve, okay, in order to explain the one we do when we do monopoly theory. So it is imperfect competition in the sense that rather than having a perfectly horizontal demand curve, you have a downward sloping marginal revenue curve. But otherwise, is everything else is like perfect competition. In other words, you maximize profit, the cost structure. So what she did was to generalize the traditional perfect competition analysis by showing that it's just a special case of the general construct. But the general framework is the same. While what we interpret by imperfect competition is the price formation is different, that you are, for instance, like in markup theory, that the way in which prices are formed and that you put a markup, or so the whole idea of imperfect competition is not just making the traditional perfect competition a special case, but to change the framework of analysis. For instance, in game theory or in other contexts, you take into consideration the interaction. I do something, but on the expectation that somebody else is doing, like in duopoly and so forth. So I think that what this imperfect competition in Joan Robinson case, that's the reason why she became dissatisfied with it. Because it was just a generalization of the Marshallian theory without making a really break with the idea of equilibrium of supply and demand and so forth. So I don't know if I answered your question, but that would be my answer. Diego?
Yes, Diego, do you want to give you a comment?
Me?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I just
Sorry, you said that you had something to ask.
Yeah, no, but I didn't hear John clearly. So I have a comment in defense of Strafa in terms of how you posit his work, that I think it should be recalled that the title of production, the subtitle, Production of Commodities by Means of Commodities, is a prelude to a critique of economic theory. So what Strafa does is not only the reconstruction, provides the analytical toolkit for the reconstruction of classical political economy, but also for the future work that can include a world with money and other features and demand and so on, as the controversies on capacity utilization and so on and so forth. So as I think he in my interpretation, I have no proof but no doubts that in some extent he was aiming to reconstruct an analytical framework capable uh, of of placing Marxist theory or classical theory once again in the as the toolkit to work in economics. So in that regard, that I am kind of like on discarding the Marshallian neoclassical toolkit field. That's the comment. And the other one is a question. How you rescue the Joan Robinson life and work in terms of her approach to build a research program and her attitude to it? Because it seems to me that probably because being a woman, and I think like the comparison with Vania Bambirra in the dependency theory school also made her bright and shine a light on everyone else works, because didn't have a kind of like an ego, like a male ego to fulfill. She both were in some kind of competitive environments, Vania Bambirra in more like oppressive ones. But how will you rescue her attitude to research in terms of producing knowledge collectively, and in terms of a program, in terms of trying to ensemble different authors and and how that is a valuable lesson for researchers today, that many times try to say like, this is my research and I'm right and you're wrong and so on, instead of trying to have a more integrative attitude in terms of constructing knowledge.
Well, it's not an easy question to answer, because one, you have to distinguish between personality trait and intellectual profile. As a personality trait, as I told you, she could be very blunt, and if you didn't agree with her, she will smack you. She was that was I was told, because I didn't have that experience, that people who did supervising with her had this experience of a very strong and type of. But this was a personality trait. Intellectually, I mean, I think she was the most open to the different traditions, any of them, because she was the one who really wanted to integrate. And I don't know whether you read an article I did she wrote a lot of reviews, okay? I wrote an article reviewing her reviews, 134, by the way. And she was absolutely curious and open to integrate, to know a lot about China, about South America, so intellectually, she was certainly daring and open-minded. As a personality trait, I think she was a little bit rigid in terms of, if you agree with her, fine. If you don't agree with her, then you were wrong. But that seems to me more a personality trait than an intellectual attitude. If you could challenge her, she would accept the challenge. But you had to be very good at it. And sometimes, people were put off by her. During the Cambridge controversy, for instance, apparently she went to Summerson, I think, course. She sat in the first row of Samuelson class. Each time the Samuelson used the word capital, she was raise her hand and say, "What do you mean by that?" And so she kept interrupting him all the time. And then Samuelson became so sick of it, he said that she was not allowed to attend the course because she was so, persistent. So that's a personality trait. It's not an intellect. She was right. Samuelson were using capital in a way that was not appropriate because of the controversy over the measurement of capital. But she kept going on and on and on, and perhaps that was not the best strategy. I don't know. But intellectually she was right, but personality trait, she was too antagonistic, and that I don't know it helps. I don't think it helped.
Just as a brief comment, I think that analytical divide for any study of history of economic thought is really important.
Patrick had a comment in the chat about the nature of Shake's critique of neoclassical theories of competition and his alternative account of real competition. In terms of I think my interpretation of Shake's critique of neoclassical competition is that it's the same essentially as Joan Robinson's critique of her own earlier position. The emphasis on equilibrium as the kind of central concept that needs to be transcended in a theory of real competition.
Yes, I agree that but you see, the tendency to equal rate of profit is a classical approach to competition. While she was talking about imperfect competition with supply and demand, marginal cost, marginal revenue, and this is nothing to do with the equalization of the rate of profit. In fact, the competition in the classical sense is precisely what it is here in the chat, is the equalization of the rate of profit, the capital moving from one sector to another, and so forth. But the Marshallian perfect competition is just, supply and demand and maximizing profit, the point in which demand or marginal revenue intersect the cost, the rising cost curve. So that's the difference. In perfect competition, you have demand, which is a flat line, and in perfect competition, you are just a downward sloping. But the apparatus is the same, is not a really change in the conception. While in the classical theory, competition has to do with movement of capital, equalization of rate of profit, is a completely different conceptual apparatus. Mm-hmm. That's why she felt that, the book was still in the line of Marshall that she was abandoning in favor of the tradition of first of Keynes and then of Marx and Sraffa.
Well, and unless is there any more questions for Cristina?
Sorry, I just want to ask: Are you thinking of turning this into like a book-length biography?
I've been asked completely just recently. Cambridge University Press pestering me. Why don't you write a biography of her? I don't feel I want to do a biography of them. I mean, I have said what I wanted to say about her in several articles, and I don't think that I would add much just putting in a book. I'm not a book-length person myself. I rather, even if I've done it, but and my last book is a collection of my essays. Let me show you. I don't know if I can show you my book.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. You can see it.
Can you see it?
Actually, it's difficult to see because of the...
Yeah, difficult to see. Sorry. Anyway, okay. No, because there is this screen that helps. Anyway, it's called Economic Theory, Protagonists and Facts. Came out last year by Palgrave. And is a collection of my essays. And I discovered that I rather like, because that allowed me to change topic and so on, I rather work on a smaller scale, but on more topics. Perhaps I'm not good enough to do at a large scale, or I don't know. So I have so many. Basically, I don't have much to add to what I have already done. That would be my question, my answer. Sorry, I said what I know about her, and I don't think I have much more to add. I'm looking forward to other people to do that. I would love to learn something more for other people. So I hope that you do it, that you people, young people, do it. And I'm looking forward to learn more than to preach what I have already done.
Well, thank you, Cristina. It's been wonderful to have you present. I would just wish you could have been here in person, back in Amherst in person, but it was really,
I
really
really,
stimulating.
I cannot tell you how happy I am to be able to be with you once again after so many years. And I have wonderful memories of Amherst. I met wonderful friends, and I hope one time I will be able to come back the occasion. I'm the president of the History of Economic Society, which
Already.
which meets in the United States mostly. But somehow, so in 2027, we will be in Boston. So
Oh,
perhaps,
that sounds like a good time.
yeah, perhaps we could. I could make a trip and visit you all.
That will be wonderful. Whoever's organizing the workshop at that time, I will make sure then
Yeah,
to
I'm not
let you
sure
know.
whether the time is right because that will be in June or something. But it
Mm,
doesn't matter for the workshop. Just if people are around, I may
yeah.
be able to come and visit you. But if you are interested in the History of Economic Society, um, you can go into the website historyofeconomicsociety.org, and maybe you might consider coming to Boston to give a talk. Or there is a young scholar program for postdoc for young doctoral students, so maybe that could be a chance to consider.
I know we have several students working in the history of economic thought now, and I'm sure they'll be very interested. So thank you
Yeah,
for that.
that would be in Boston. But then we will have the first joint conference, European and the American one, in Nice in 2006.
Mhm.
And we are just advertising now a program for young scholar with grants, travel grant, to check it out because
Fantastic.
you might apply. I think the deadline is before Christmas.
I will check it
Yeah,
out and share it with our students.
yeah, 15 grants for young people to attend the conference. So check it out.
Thank you very much,
No,
Cristina.
thank you, and best wishes for the coming holidays to all of you.
You too. You too.
Bye bye.
Thank you all for attending.
Bye
Goodbye.
bye. Bye bye. Bye bye.